The freezing winds of Chicago whipped against the reinforced glass of the 32nd floor of the Apex corporate tower, as if the turbulent night itself demanded to witness the quiet collision of two entirely different worlds. It was approaching midnight, and the financial heart of the city had long since surrendered to sleep, leaving only a scattering of illuminated windows across the sprawling urban grid. Up in the executive penthouse, where fortunes were whispered into existence and erased with a keystroke, an invisible thread of destiny was about to pull two strangers together. Eleanor Bennett Quinn pushed her heavy cleaning cart down the thick carpeted hallway with the measured silent steps she had perfected over the last decade of her life. She was a woman of middle age, possessing an intelligent, observant gaze that she kept carefully lowered, working the graveyard shift for the city's premier commercial maintenance service. Slung over her shoulder was a faded fabric bag holding a thermos of honey-sweetened tea, a bruised apple, and a thick, dark blue hardcover book filled with complex stochastic equations. That book was an anomaly, an object that no other member of the night crew would ever carry, and something that would have surely arrested the breath of any quantitative analyst on the floor had they ever bothered to look at her. But the golden rule of the 32nd floor was that the woman pushing the cleaning cart was practically invisible, a ghost meant to erase smudges and vanish before the sun rose. As she approached the final stretch of the corridor, the dry, authoritative voice of Ruth Smith Miller, the veteran night supervisor, drifted over the radio clipped to Eleanor's apron, warning her about the corner office. Ruth explained that the chief executive was still locked inside, having requested absolute isolation nearly 30 minutes prior, and instructed Eleanor to wait until he departed, or to enter silently clean only the bare minimum, and leave without uttering a single greeting. Eleanor simply acknowledged the command with a quiet murmur, long having learned that unspoken words burdened the soul far less than the hollow pleasantries one was forced to exchange in corporate spaces. Left alone in the dim corridor, Eleanor slowly began her routine in the adjacent glass-walled conference rooms, wiping down tables, collecting abandoned coffee cups, and emptying bins filled with discarded financial reports. Though she never actively sought to read the crumpled documents, her eyes possessed an involuntary, lightning-fast ability to recognize the structural integrity of a quarterly balance or a risk exposure matrix in mere fractions of a second. Years ago, before her life had fractured into pieces, Eleanor Bennett Quinn had been a completely different woman, one who had studied advanced risk modeling and algorithmic anomaly detection at a prestigious European university. She had thrived at the quantitative trading desk of a globally recognized financial institution, back when she was young and the entire world felt like an open map full of limitless mathematical possibilities. Her father, Edward Bennett Owens, an esteemed university professor of applied mathematics, had placed a scientific calculator in her hands long before she ever held a doll, teaching her that numbers were the only language incapable of lying. But that brilliant, ambitious woman had been carefully packed away into the deepest recesses of Eleanor's heart a very long time ago, buried alongside the worn photograph of her late husband, David Quinn Anderson. David had perished in a devastating accident when their daughter Lily was still just a little girl, leaving Eleanor to navigate a sudden terrifying reality that was soon compounded by Lily developing a severe, chronic medical condition. The ensuing years had demanded every single minute of Eleanor's time, every last dollar in her savings, and the complete abandonment of her professional trajectory to ensure her child survived. She had sold her home, liquidated her portfolios, completely vanished from the financial sector, and dedicated her entire existence to sitting in hospital waiting rooms reading her old textbooks just to keep her mind sharp. Today, Lily was a brilliant young woman studying medicine at a local university, completely unaware of the crushing magnitude of the professional sacrifice her mother had silently placed on the altar of her survival. Now entering her later years, Lacking a recent resume, possessing no professional network, and devoid of the energy to rebuild from absolute zero, Eleanor had accepted the maintenance job at the Apex corporate tower simply because it paid the medical debts and allowed her to read at dawn. As she finally rounded the corner toward the main executive suite of Apex Capital Partners, she noticed the heavy mahogany door was left slightly ajar, spilling an erratic, violent glow into the hallway. It was not the steady, sterile white light of the ceiling fixtures, but the chaotic, pulsating glare of multiple trading monitors flashing simultaneously, painting the dark room in aggressive shades of crimson. From within that pulsating red glow, Eleanor heard a sound that immediately froze the blood in her veins, the suppressed, agonizing, and deeply ashamed sobbing of a grown man who had held his despair in for far too long. She stopped her cart instantly, her hands gripping the plastic handle tight, remembering Ruth's strict instructions to remain invisible, do the bare minimum, and never intrude upon the personal miseries of the executives. The most logical course of action was to quietly back away, skip the corner suite entirely, and return to clean it the following night, when the emotional wreckage had been cleared away by the daylight. But just as she took a step backward, a broken, breathless whisper echoed from the dark office, a man repeating in absolute devastation that he had lost everything and could not understand how it was possible. Eleanor swallowed hard, her heart pounding against her ribs, and in that precise moment, a sound pierced the air that shocked her far more than the weeping executive's confession of financial ruin. It was a highly specific, repetitive auditory pattern. 3 short, sharp tones, followed by a pause, and then 3 short tones again, a definitive system alert that she had written her entire master's thesis about. It was the unmistakable sonic signature of parameters being breached from the inside, indicating that the algorithmic engine was being manipulated by foreign logic. And Eleanor knew she could not simply walk away from a mathematical crime in progress. Oliver Miller Lawson, the founding titan and chief executive of Apex Capital Partners, sat utterly defeated behind his massive glass desk, his tie undone, his cuffs unbuttoned, and his hands pressing brutally against his temples. He barely registered the soft click of the door or the presence of the cleaning woman pushing her cart into the room, viewing her merely as an insignificant shadow moving across the periphery of his shattered world. He muttered a hoarse command for her to clean quickly and leave his bloodshot eyes entirely focused on the cascading red graphs that were currently vaporizing 2 decades of his relentless labor and personal sacrifice. Eleanor nodded silently and began to gather the trash, wiping the edges of the pristine desk with her cloth, though her sharp eyes were doing something entirely different from her working hands. In the span of just 3 seconds, her gaze scanned the intricate data streaming across the 3 massive monitors, deciphering the chaos with a terrifying precision that none of the high-paid analysts in the building possessed. What she witnessed on the central screen caused her breathing to hitch. She saw the distinct, undeniable fingerprint of ghost executions draining the fund's positions at a microsecond velocity entirely imperceptible to the untrained human eye. The pattern of these anomalies did not correlate with any external market collapse, geopolitical event, or sector-wide sell-off. Rather, it perfectly matched an internal sequencing loop designed to siphon capital, while masking itself as regular market turbulence. This destroyed, weeping man sitting before her was not being financially ruined by the brutal, unpredictable forces of the global market, but was instead being systematically bled dry by someone operating from within his own trusted walls. Eleanor slowly straightened her posture, gripping her cleaning cloth against her apron, and for the first time in over a decade, she clearly heard the booming voice of her late father, reminding her that when the numbers scream, one must speak. Drawing a deep, fortifying breath, she placed her hand firmly on the edge of the glass desk, and softly, but with absolute authority, informed the chief executive that his screens were not displaying a market failure. The heavy silence that crashed down upon the office following Eleanor's words weighed infinitely more than any scream of panic ever could, suffocating the ambient hum of the towering Chicago skyscraper. Oliver stopped breathing, his hands slowly lowering from his face as he stared at the woman in the cleaning apron, his exhausted brain violently struggling to process an intervention that defied every logical category of his corporate existence. This invisible woman, hired to empty his trash, had just articulated in one elegant sentence a reality that he and his panic-stricken team had failed to diagnose over 4 agonizing hours of frantic troubleshooting. His voice emerged raw and trembling as he demanded to know what she had just said, leaning forward in his leather chair, as if hoping the shadows of the room would reveal she was merely an auditory hallucination. Eleanor's pulse roared in her ears, her prudent instincts screaming at her to apologize, claim ignorance, and run back to the safety of her cart. But the dormant quantitative analyst within her refused to retreat into the dark again. Holding his intense gaze without flinching, Eleanor reiterated her diagnosis, pointing directly toward the right side column of the central monitor, and instructing him to observe the execution intervals logged down to the exact millisecond. She explained that standard high-frequency trades possess a natural chaotic variation, but his recent logs displayed a terrifying synthetic regularity, where every 43rd operation deviated entirely from the foundational logic of his primary algorithm. She told him that such rigid mathematical patterns do not generate themselves organically in a free market, but are intentionally programmed by human hands, urging him to shut down the core algorithmic engine immediately before his remaining capital vanished entirely. Oliver swiveled his chair violently toward the screens, leaning in mere inches from the glass, analyzing the cascading data not with the blinding panic of a victim, but with the cold, calculating fury of a man realizing he was being robbed. 30 seconds stretched into an eternity as he traced the exact sequence she had identified, finally realizing that the parasitic code was perfectly disguised within his own proprietary architecture, waiting for this exact night to strike. With a trembling but decisive hand, Oliver hammered a rapid sequence of override commands across his keyboard, inputting a master kill switch password that immediately severed the algorithmic engine from the broader financial exchanges. The monitors flickered twice before freezing, completely replacing the aggressive flashing crimson warnings with the static muted tones of dormant software, plunging the expansive executive suite into a profound, ringing silence. Oliver collapsed back into his chair, squeezing his eyes shut, as a wave of nausea and profound relief washed over him, recognizing that this anonymous cleaner had just salvaged a massive portion of his life's work. When he finally opened his eyes, he looked at Eleanor with a completely new expression, respectfully asking for her full name, and softly demanding to know exactly how a night shift janitor possessed the knowledge of a senior quantitative engineer. Eleanor lowered her gaze for a brief moment, feeling the heavy silence of her past decade rising in her throat like a river finally breaching a dam, and quietly revealed her academic pedigree and her former life in the European markets. Oliver was rendered entirely speechless, his eyes wandering from her dignified face to the worn cleaning cart, and finally settling on the heavy fabric bag slung over her shoulder, containing the thick blue textbook. He respectfully asked to see the book, and Eleanor produced the advanced mathematical modeling text, its margins heavily annotated in pencil, laying it gently upon his desk, like a sacred relic of a forgotten religion. Tracing the worn cover with his fingertips, Oliver looked up at her with a profound mixture of disbelief, sorrow, and deep admiration, stating unequivocally that she belonged in an executive boardroom, not wandering the halls with a bucket. He stood up and paced toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering Chicago skyline, his mind rapidly connecting the dots of the internal sabotage, realizing with a sickening drop in his stomach that only one other person possessed the access to alter that code. He turned back to Eleanor, his face pale and his voice tight with betrayal, confirming her worst suspicion: the only other human being on the planet with the architectural keys to that engine was his founding partner and oldest friend. The name of Isaac Baker Scott hung in the chilled air of the office like a death sentence, carrying the weight of a two-decade friendship that had just been violently exposed as a hollow, parasitic lie. Oliver leaned heavily against the glass pane, the sheer magnitude of the personal treason breaking him in a way the financial loss never could, remembering how Isaac had stood beside him at his own father's funeral. Gathering his fragmented composure, Oliver turned to Eleanor with absolute resolve, explaining that if Isaac was orchestrating this massive drain tonight, he had meticulously planned it, knowing Oliver would be alone and vulnerable in the building. He asked Eleanor a monumental favor, begging her to stay with him until dawn to help meticulously document every single microscopic anomaly, ensuring he could face his traitorous partner with undeniable, mathematically perfect evidence rather than mere emotional suspicions. Eleanor felt a surge of genuine fear, realizing that saying yes meant crossing a threshold from which she could never return to her quiet, invisible life. But the thought of Lily's courage inspired her to nod her head in solemn agreement. Oliver immediately picked up his internal telephone, dialing the security desk at the ground-floor lobby to speak with Paul Vance Carter, the elderly observant night porter who had worked at the tower since it opened. He instructed Paul to discreetly inform Ruth, the cleaning supervisor, that Eleanor was assisting him with an urgent operational emergency and would remain in the executive suite all night, assuming full administrative responsibility for her time. Paul, who had always seen the hidden greatness carrying that blue book through his lobby, agreed without hesitation, promising absolute discretion and wishing the chief executive good luck with whatever battle he was facing upstairs. Hanging up the phone, Oliver offered Eleanor a small, genuine smile, confessing that Paul had always warned him there was a brilliant woman pushing a cart in his building, and apologizing for taking so long to open his eyes. Together, the betrayed millionaire and the invisible cleaner pulled up chairs in front of the frozen screens, plunging into the labyrinth of data to reconstruct the digital footprints of a man who believed himself to be an untouchable genius. For hours, they worked in a state of intense, synchronized focus, with Oliver acting as the lightning-fast operator of the terminal, while Eleanor served as the strategic architect, dictating exactly which data blocks to cross-reference and isolate. They discovered that the 43rd execution anomaly was brilliantly disguised with a false identification hash, masquerading as a legitimate internal transfer while quietly siphoning a tiny fraction of capital into a hidden external routing protocol. Eleanor pointed out that the overarching aesthetic of the malicious code was a perfect mimicry of Oliver's style, but the internal syntax bore the distinct sloppy habits of a different programmer who had grown lazy with arrogance. Oliver confirmed with a heavy heart that Isaac had been their lead programmer before transitioning entirely into the role of a managing partner, knowing every single blind spot in the system, because they had built the original architecture side by side. Tracing the pattern backward through the logs, they realized the fund had been bleeding out slowly for many months, entirely undetected by standard audits, until tonight's sudden, aggressive acceleration aimed at completely crippling the firm by morning. Eleanor analyzed the sudden spike in frequency, deducing that Isaac intentionally engineered this crisis to force the board of directors into a desperate panic, compelling them to accept a hostile buyout from an external entity. Oliver realized instantly that this explained Isaac's relentless recent push to entertain offers from a specific international investment group, a deal Oliver had vehemently rejected 3 separate times in the past quarter. Knowing he needed a watertight legal strategy before the sun rose, Oliver dialed Catherine Vance Roberts, his formidable, brilliantly sharp criminal attorney, who specialized in complex financial fraud and corporate espionage. Despite the ungodly hour, Catherine promised to arrive at the Chicago Tower within 30 minutes, advising Oliver to lock down all server access and touch nothing further until she had established a secure chain of custody for the digital evidence. While they waited for the attorney, Oliver stepped back to the window, the adrenaline fading to leave a hollow exhaustion, and gently asked Eleanor why a mind like hers had been forced to abandon the industry completely. Under the soft glow of a single desk lamp, Eleanor leaned back and finally shared the painful, beautiful truth of her life, detailing the sudden loss of David and the terrifying medical diagnosis that had threatened to take little Lily as well. She recounted selling off every material possession, the endless nights sleeping in rigid hospital chairs, and the eventual miraculous recovery of her daughter, who was now dedicating her own life to healing others at the University Medical School. She explained the harsh reality of trying to re-enter a hyper-competitive financial market as an older woman with a massive gap in her resume, finding that corporate doors were firmly locked, leaving the cleaning cart as her only honest option. Oliver listened with tears shining in his eyes, profoundly moved by the staggering depth of her maternal sacrifice, and confessed his own deep regrets regarding his father Richard, whom he had neglected during his final days while building this very company. Eleanor offered him a gentle, forgiving wisdom, assuring him that his father had loved him for the man he was trying to become, and that he should not carry the guilt of Isaac's deception as his own personal failure. Catherine arrived like a localized storm, her sharp suit impeccable, despite the hour immediately transforming the emotional atmosphere of the office into a rigid tactical command center focused entirely on legal destruction. After being introduced to Eleanor, Catherine treated her with the immediate validating respect of a peer utilizing Eleanor's technical translation of the code to draft ironclad affidavits and warrants for the impending confrontation. They worked tirelessly as the dark sky over Lake Michigan began to lighten into a pale, icy blue, finalizing a comprehensive dossier that left the treacherous partner with absolutely no room to maneuver, deny, or escape. Catherine outlined the aggressive morning strategy. She and Oliver would confront Isaac directly, while Eleanor remained in the adjacent viewing room with the technical evidence ready to be deployed as the ultimate unexpected weapon if Isaac dared to lie. As the first true rays of morning sun pierced the office, Oliver promised Eleanor that regardless of how the morning unfolded, she would never push a maintenance cart in this city again, setting the stage for a reckoning. The early morning quiet of the executive suite was abruptly shattered by the sound of confident, expensive leather shoes striding down the carpeted hallway, arriving precisely 45 minutes earlier than the official start of the business day. The heavy mahogany door swung open to reveal Isaac Baker Scott, impeccably tailored and holding a steaming cup of artisan coffee, wearing the practiced, sympathetic smile of a friend arriving to console a devastated partner. However, that false smile instantly froze, dying completely on his face as his eyes adjusted to the scene before him. Oliver sitting rigidly behind the desk, a high-powered criminal attorney organizing files, and a cleaning woman standing tall beside the central monitors. Isaac's eyes darted frantically around the room, taking in the static screens, the detailed technical notebooks, and Catherine zipping up her leather briefcase, his predatory instincts screaming that he had walked blindly into a meticulously laid trap. Attempting to salvage his facade, Isaac forced a weak laugh and demanded to know what on earth was going on, asking why a janitor was attending a confidential executive meeting before the sun had even fully risen. Oliver did not raise his voice. Instead, he stood up slowly, buttoned his suit jacket, and stared at the man who had stood beside him at his father's grave, his voice practically radiating a lethal controlled coldness. He commanded Isaac to sit down, cutting through his partner's stammering protests with a singular sharp repetition of the order, forcing the terrified executive to slowly place his coffee on a side table and lower himself into the chair. Oliver methodically recounted the events of the previous night, explaining how he had stayed late, witnessed the catastrophic bleeding of their accounts, and nearly lost his mind to despair, believing the market had turned against their life's work. He raised a hand to silence Isaac's pathetic attempt to interrupt and formally introduced the woman standing quietly by the screens as Eleanor Bennett Quinn, a master of algorithmic anomaly detection who had diagnosed the internal sabotage in mere seconds. Isaac turned his head slowly to look at Eleanor, the sheer absurdity and terror of being completely undone by the building's invisible cleaning staff washing over his pale face as he realized the depth of his exposure. Oliver detailed the precise architecture of the 43 operation cycle, explaining how Eleanor and Catherine had spent the entire night tracing the masked routing protocols directly back to Isaac's personal administrative credentials. Isaac desperately attempted to dismiss the accusations as ridiculous, claiming the cleaner could not possibly understand their proprietary code. But Catherine smoothly intervened, turning her laptop screen to face the cornered man. Displayed brightly on the screen was a damning chain of encrypted emails legally extracted hours ago, detailing Isaac's explicit negotiations with the Overseas Investment Group, outlining the precise percentages he would receive for intentionally crippling Apex Capital Partners. The room fell into a suffocating absolute silence as Isaac stared at his own digital treason, his hand nervously adjusting his expensive silk tie, his breathing shallow and rapid as the walls of his elite world collapsed inward. Catherine calmly informed him that a notary was currently waiting in the lobby to formalize his complete surrender of equity, and that Oliver had already authorized her to file federal charges for wire fraud and criminal conspiracy. With the cold pragmatism of a seasoned prosecutor, Catherine offered Isaac exactly two choices: walk out the door and face a brutal, highly public federal prosecution that would end in a lengthy prison sentence, or sign a full confession today. If he chose to surrender, voluntarily returning all embezzled funds and formally relinquishing his partnership, Oliver would agree to handle the separation privately, sparing the firm a devastating public scandal and keeping Isaac out of a federal penitentiary. Isaac stared at the thick carpet for a long time, the arrogant fight completely draining from his posture, leaving behind only the pathetic shell of a greedy man who had gambled his entire life and lost spectacularly. When he finally spoke, his voice was a broken, whining whisper, confessing that it had started as a small personal debt he thought he could cover, but the hole had grown too deep, and the overseas investors had offered an easy escape. Oliver looked at him with profound disgust and deep sorrow, reminding Isaac of how much his late father had loved him, and how Isaac had spent Sunday dinners at his house while systematically robbing him blind. Unable to meet Oliver's gaze, Isaac buried his face in his trembling hands, quietly weeping tears of self-pity, an ugly display of broken pride that prompted Eleanor to politely avert her eyes, finding no joy in witnessing a human being's ultimate degradation. Catherine briskly ordered the disgraced partner into the adjacent holding room to await the arrival of his own legal counsel, ensuring he had no access to any communication devices or computer terminals while the final surrender documents were being prepared. Once the heavy door clicked shut behind the traitor, the main office felt suddenly lighter, the toxic presence completely removed, leaving Oliver to collapse back into his leather chair with a heavy, exhausted sigh of finality. He looked across the room at Eleanor, his eyes conveying a depth of gratitude that words could scarcely capture, repeatedly thanking her for saving his legacy, his company, and his own sense of personal dignity. Before Eleanor could deflect the praise, her personal cellular phone, which she had left resting on the corner of the desk, began to vibrate aggressively, the bright screen displaying an incoming call from her daughter Lily. Realizing she was hours late returning to their small apartment, Eleanor answered the phone with a rush of maternal guilt, hearing Lily's panicked, breathless voice demanding to know where she was and why her uniform was missing from the closet. Eleanor tried to soothe her daughter, speaking in gentle, reassuring tones, explaining that there had been a highly unusual situation at the building, and promising to explain everything as soon as she navigated her way home. But Lily, possessing the sharp, relentless intuition of a medical student, heard the exhausted, emotional tremor in her mother's voice, instantly assuming Eleanor had been unfairly terminated or mistreated by the corporate staff. Refusing to accept her mother's deflections, Lily stubbornly declared she was already on a train heading straight for the financial district, demanding the floor number and abruptly hanging up the phone before Eleanor could even attempt to stop her. Oliver, having quietly listened to the exchange, offered Eleanor a warm, encouraging smile, insisting that he wanted to meet the young woman who had inspired such monumental sacrifice, eager for Lily to see exactly who her mother truly was. The high-speed elevator of the Apex corporate tower ascended smoothly, carrying Lily Quinn toward the executive penthouse, her heart racing with a protective fury as she prepared to defend her mother from whatever corporate cruelty had kept her all night. She was dressed in her practical university clothes, a heavy medical textbook stuffed into her backpack, her eyes still carrying the shadows of late-night studying, completely unaware that she was stepping out of her familiar reality and into a profound revelation. When the silver doors parted, she stepped tentatively onto the plush carpeting of the 32nd floor, a world of extravagant wealth her mother had always vaguely described as incredibly boring, a loving lie, designed to shield Lily from the truth of her sacrifice. Down in the lobby, Paul the porter had directed her to the correct suite, looking her straight in the eye and telling her that her mother carried more dignity in her pinky finger than the rest of the billionaires in the building combined. As she slowly approached the open mahogany door at the end of the long corridor, she expected to find her mother holding a mop, perhaps being scolded by a harsh manager over a spilled cup of coffee. Instead, Lily peeked into the expansive office and froze her breath, catching in her throat as she witnessed Eleanor sitting comfortably in a luxurious leather chair, engaging in an intense, equal conversation with a powerful man in a tailored suit. There was no cleaning cart in sight. Instead, her mother was surrounded by complex financial documents, legal pads, and sophisticated computer monitors, exuding a calm, authoritative brilliance that Lily had never seen, yet somehow instinctively recognized. Hearing the soft intake of breath, Eleanor turned toward the door, her face immediately breaking into a radiant, tearful smile, and she stood up to cross the room, wrapping her daughter in a fierce, desperately loving embrace. Lily clung to her mother's shoulders, her voice trembling as she asked what was happening and who these people were, bewildered by the surreal atmosphere of the room and the strange, respectful way the millionaire was looking at the woman in the apron. Oliver stepped forward with immense grace, extending his hand to the medical student, introducing himself, and stating with absolute sincerity that her mother had just saved his entire enterprise and, more importantly, had saved his soul in the process. Gently guiding her highly confused daughter to a chair across from the glass desk, Eleanor took Lily's hands in her own, taking a deep breath as Oliver respectfully stepped away toward the windows to grant them privacy. Eleanor began to unravel the carefully constructed narrative of their lives, speaking softly about David, the brilliant civil engineer who laughed easily, and Edward, the mathematics professor, who had taught her to read algorithms like poetry. She finally confessed the truth about her own past, the prestigious European university, the elite quantitative risk master's degree, and her thrilling early career working on global trading desks before tragedy violently rewrote the trajectory of their family. She explained the terrifying days of Lily's childhood illness, the brutal reality of medical bankruptcy, the rapid liquidation of their assets, and her conscious, unhesitating decision to lock away her brilliant career to ensure she could hold her daughter's hand in the hospital. Lily listened in stunned silence, tears spilling hot and fast down her cheeks. finally understanding the true staggering weight of the empty spaces in their history, and the reason her mother had always encouraged her scientific studies so fiercely. When Eleanor finished her story, Lily slipped out of her chair and knelt on the thick carpet, wrapping her arms tightly around her mother's waist, weeping openly and apologizing for never knowing the magnitude of the dreams Eleanor had buried for her. Eleanor stroked her daughter's hair, her own tears falling freely, whispering fiercely that she did not regret a single second of her choice, and that watching Lily walk into a hospital to heal others was a greater return on investment than any financial market could ever offer. Over by the window, the millionaire Oliver Miller Lawson wiped his own eyes deeply, moved by the raw, undeniable power of their bond, wishing desperately that he had possessed a fraction of that emotional clarity while his own father was still alive. Just as the emotional intensity of the room began to settle, Catherine strode back in, holding a fresh stack of legal agreements and signaling that Isaac's defense attorney had finally arrived in the adjacent room to begin the surrender process. Recognizing that the ensuing hours would be filled with tedious, ugly legal warfare, Oliver gently instructed Eleanor to take Lily downstairs to the lobby cafe, insisting they take their time and process the morning together while he handled the corporate garbage. Down in the bright, bustling lobby cafe, Eleanor and Lily sat by a large window, watching the Chicago morning rush hour, a pair of warm, frothy lattes and fresh pastries resting on the small table between them. Benjamin, the cheerful young barista, had explicitly refused Eleanor's money, flashing a bright smile and stating that Mr. Lawson had strictly commanded that their tab was entirely covered for the day, treating them like visiting royalty. The silence between mother and daughter was no longer heavy with unspoken secrets, but light and expansive, filled with the profound peace of two women who had survived the absolute worst of life and emerged completely intact. Lily reached across the table, her eyes shining with fierce pride, and extracted a solemn promise from her mother that she would never hide her brilliant mind behind a maintenance cart, again demanding that Eleanor reclaim the space she so rightfully deserved. Eleanor nodded slowly, squeezing her daughter's hands, feeling a dormant, powerful spark igniting within her chest, realizing that the brilliant quantitative analyst she had buried over a decade ago was finally ready to step back into the light of the world. Meanwhile, high above the bustling city in the tense atmosphere of the holding room, Isaac Baker Scott signed away his entire professional existence, his signature trembling as Catherine mercilessly documented his complete removal from the firm. Oliver watched the pathetic end of his former friend with a cold detachment, his mind already shifting to the future, drafting the exact parameters of a highly specialized executive position he intended to create before noon. He pulled out his cellular phone and dialed the private number of Matthew Anderson Carter, a highly respected, fiercely ethical financial journalist known for valuing human truth over cheap corporate scandal, telling him to get to the tower immediately. Oliver knew that the story of this night could not be buried, but he was utterly determined that the narrative would not center around a greedy partner's betrayal, but rather around the absolute genius of the woman who had caught him in 3 seconds. As the morning sun fully illuminated the steel and glass canyons of Chicago, the stage was perfectly set for Eleanor Bennett Quinn to rise from the invisible shadows and permanently alter the landscape of the city's financial district. When Eleanor and Lily finally returned to the 32nd floor, the chaotic energy of the early morning had settled into a sharp professional calm, with the heavy velvet curtains drawn back to reveal the spectacular, sweeping views of the Chicago skyline. Oliver was seated in the comfortable lounge area of his office rather than behind his imposing desk, and standing beside him was a nervous but incredibly sharp-looking young man whom Eleanor had never met before. Oliver warmly introduced the young man as Thomas Reed Adams, the senior quantitative analyst for the fund, explaining that Thomas had been the one to accidentally mute the initial warning alerts on his phone while attending a crowded family dinner. Thomas stepped forward, extending his hand to Eleanor with genuine, profound reverence, openly apologizing for his catastrophic oversight and humbly begging for the opportunity to learn from the master who had caught what he had so foolishly dismissed. Eleanor accepted his handshake with a gracious, forgiving smile, reminding the young analyst that mistakes were merely the tuition one paid for experience, a sentiment that made Oliver smile, confirming that Thomas was exactly the kind of student she needed. Gesturing for Eleanor to take the seat of honor opposite him, Oliver retrieved a thick, elegant leather folder from the coffee table, his posture radiating a mix of profound respect and eager anticipation as he prepared to change her life. He stated clearly that what Eleanor had executed the previous night was not a stroke of luck, but the undeniable manifestation of elite world-class expertise that the vast majority of highly compensated executives lacked. Sliding the folder across the low table, Oliver formally offered her the newly minted position of Director of Anomaly Detection and Systemic Risk at Apex Capital Partners, reporting exclusively and directly to him with total authority over the quantitative team. He outlined her mandate to completely rebuild the firm's algorithmic auditing protocols from scratch, ensuring a betrayal of this magnitude could never happen again. With a starting compensation package that rivaled the top risk executives on Wall Street. Looking down at the typed contract bearing her name, Eleanor saw not just numbers, but the proud, smiling face of her father Edward, sitting at their old kitchen table, promising her that the world would one day be ready for her brilliant mind. With Lily's encouragement, Eleanor accepted Oliver's extraordinary job offer, while journalist Matthew Carter documented the remarkable events with respect and accuracy, highlighting Eleanor's academic excellence, personal sacrifices, and technical brilliance rather than Oliver's role. The published investigation transformed Eleanor into an inspiration for scholars, working mothers, and young professionals. Isaac abandoned his fraudulent ambitions to begin a humbler life. Oliver honored his late father's values and recognized that integrity outweighs wealth. And retired porter Paul left Eleanor a notebook, revealing he had long believed in her potential. Weeks later, Eleanor and Lily celebrated in their new home after learning that Oliver's charitable foundation had established the Eleanor Bennett Quinn Grant for Exceptional Resilience, a scholarship for the children of maintenance and service workers, inspiring Lily to pursue her pediatric residency while honoring her mother's sacrifices. The story ultimately proves that genuine success is defined not by wealth titles or status, but by character, resilience, and selfless love. Eleanor's decision to sacrifice her own ambitions for her daughter while quietly preserving her extraordinary talent became the foundation for an even greater future. Those who judge others by appearance or occupation often overlook hidden brilliance and quiet strength. When people like Eleanor finally have the opportunity to reveal their true abilities, they do not need grand displays or loud voices. The truth alone is powerful enough to command the respect and attention of everyone around them.